Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Heyman Marrero from Urbander, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU. Hello, everybody. I wanted to bring a new friend, Brittany Ramos DeBarros, all the way from Staten Island, New York. Hi, Brittany. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing really great. Thank you. We were introduced by a mutual friend, Tristeza
Mhm.
Ordex, and it's because, we work in activism and we're so involved, me included, right? But I'm an entrepreneur, and so I've always wondered what propels people to really take that leap into running for office. So I was talking to our friend Triste about it, and she's like, "Oh, you have to meet my friend Brittany." She finally took the plunge and she's running for office. And so I know that you've been busy with the launch of your campaign for the 11th district of New York, right? You're running for Congress. That's kind of like
Yeah.
epic. And, and also as a veteran, thank you for your service. I think that's huge, and then being a woman and an Afro-Latina. I mean, there's just so much packed into that I'm like, wow, I can see myself reflected in you. And so I'm like,
Mhm.
she would be the perfect person to basically pick your brain as to why, how, what makes you you, right? First, like where do you come from? What's your story, and what propelled you to say, you know what, that's it. I'm going to run for office. And so I'm all ears. I'm so excited to finally meet you and to be able to ask you these questions, because I'm honestly intrigued, and just to see more people of color also, seriously pausing and thinking about making a difference through public office,
Mhm.
really warms my heart. And yeah, tell me about your military background and about how you grew up. And I'm a fellow New Yorker too, so it's awesome also to be in the same space, as someone that I know, the environment and what goes down, on the streets too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for thinking of me and to Tristeza, my girl, for recommending me for this topic because the truth is I still kind of can't believe I'm doing this. Like I I literally like every other day I'm like, "Oh my God, I'm running for Congress." How did this happen? And so because it's wild, and I think a lot of us, especially women of color, were a lot of us who were raised kind of struggling or, going through different experiences in this country, often, are given the message directly or indirectly that those positions of power are not for us, right? That
Mm.
that's not where we belong, or that we're not good enough, or we don't have the expertise or the credentials or whatever it is. And yet, it means a lot to me to hear folks say things like, I see myself in you, because I
Mm.
think that what we've seen, in the political discourse and the decisions that have been made for generations, really, is that those decisions have been made by people who don't understand really, like viscerally, the day to
Mm.
day struggles that working people, people of color, women, etc., experience on any given day, and the kind of nuances around those things. And so I think that it took a lot for folks to convince me, to be real, that I was someone who should run, and that this was a worthwhile way for me to continue my work towards our movement goals. And that's what this
Mhm.
is about for me. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later. But just a little bit about me and my upbringing, to the question
Mhm.
that you asked. I grew up, um, I am a person who, at first glance, I think people are like, oh, she checks so many boxes. Like when when the political people are looking at me, they're like, she's a veteran, she's a woman, she's, these things. But the reality is I spent a lot of my life feeling like I didn't really belong in any of
Mm,
those boxes either. And I think that that's a more common experience for people than we talk about, regardless of background. I know a lot of people in my district feel that way, even about being New Yorkers. Is
mhm.
Staten Island is so often treated like it's not even really a part of New York City.
That is
And we're
so
treated,
true.
yeah,
Yes, it's so
um,
true.
yeah, and kind of treated like we're the butt of other New Yorkers' jokes a lot of the
Yeah,
times.
yeah.
And so, I think that that's why I felt a kind of kinship with this community when I moved here. And it
Mhm,
really became my home very quickly,
mhm,
a home that I had been looking for, I think, most of my life. But I say all of that to say I grew up, my biological father is Black Puerto Rican. And that's not terminology that usually you'll hear Puerto Ricans use, but I say that intentionally,
mhm,
because I think that one of the ways that Boricuas have been impacted, sometimes we don't always acknowledge, by colonization, is we've sometimes internalized this colorism, right? This kind of hierarchy, um, of the way that we relate to race. And there's all different types of Boricuas, right? There's white Puerto Ricans, there's mestizas, there's Afro Boricuas, right? All of these different things. And father, my biological father was Black, but he wanted to distance himself because he grew up in orphanages. He experienced a lot of abuse and poverty, growing up in those systems, and ended up on the streets,
mhm,
sleeping under a bridge at 15, 16 in Miami. He kind of was a
mhm,
stowaway, and to Miami, and ended up getting caught up in a lot of street life because he never had the care and the real
mhm,
investment in him as a
mhm,
human, with the kind of to get the care and respect and dignity that he needed in order to grow and be a healthy human being.
mhm,
And so, I think that the way he translated that experience and having such a hard time was, he thought, for me and my sister, his way of loving us was that he thought, I want you to distance yourself. I want you to be able to be as white and as American as possible so that you'll have a better life. And
mm,
that was his response to the discrimination and hardship that he experienced. And while I disagree with that approach, because what that means is he refused to cook Puerto Rican food, he refused to teach me Spanish, he denied his own Blackness, and he hated his own Black skin. And how tragic.
mhm,
And so I think that I disagree with that, but I understand that that's an experience that a lot of immigrant parents, and parents from colonized peoples,
mhm,
kind of undertake, because they want, at the end of the day, they're coming from a place of wanting better. And so, that's one part of my experience. And that's also why it is so important for me to claim my heritage, even though you'll hear people be, confused, like, Afro Puerto Rican. Well, you don't look that, you look pretty racially ambiguous or light skin or whatever. Um, but I think that there's a long history of our people trying to distance themselves from that
mhm,
heritage and from that culture. And that is a function of that colorism. And so I claim that heritage,
mhm.
that Afro
Yeah.
Boricua heritage, proudly. And I want my kids to claim that proudly when I have them. And
Mm,
so
yeah.
on the other side, my mom was an Army officer, and she raised us in a household. A lot of my early life, she was a single mom. And she worked incredibly hard and raised us to really have a love of country, a sense of service and duty and patriotism. And so I grew up really believing in the things that I was told America is supposed to be about, that sense of
Yeah.
justice and opportunity for all, but also being biracial and seeing her work so hard and struggle so much. I could see that, what my white family was experiencing was not the same as what my Black and Puerto Rican family had experienced.
Right.
And I could
Mhm,
also see that this idea that if anyone works hard enough could make, they can make it. I was like, well, then, my parents are working multiple jobs, working so hard, and we're still constantly struggling not to lose our house. And our church friends are having to bring us groceries to help us get by. I didn't want to ask for lunch money because money was so tight and so stressful,
Mhm.
and so I think that is an all too common experience. Um,
Yes.
and so some of that upbringing, I ended up, kind of fast forwarding, I ended up getting an army scholarship to pay for my college. And
Mhm.
by the time I graduated college, I got a business degree. At this point, I just wanted to be an entrepreneur and, build my
Yeah.
business. But I graduated and I became a platoon leader, responsible for 40 lives at the age of 22.
Wow. At the age
And I
of
already
what?
had orders. Sorry?
How old were you? You were how old?
22.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I
Wow.
commissioned as an officer and became, responsible. And I took that responsibility, that leadership responsibility very seriously. And we already had deployment orders. So I knew, I was like, okay, this is very serious. I have to, take this with the gravity that it deserves. And so
Yes.
again, I deployed to Afghanistan soon after, at the beginning of 2012. By then, a lot of people thought that we had already left Afghanistan
Yeah.
because Obama and
Mhm.
Biden had run on ending the war then.
Mhm.
And I was supposed to be part of those transition operations. And so when I went there, I really thought still, I really believed this narrative that I was going to fight for freedom and justice and help the Afghan people. This kind of narrative about protecting Afghan women and all of these things.
Yes.
And yet when I got there, I spent a lot of time with Afghan families, and it became impossible for me to deny that we were doing a lot more harm to Afghan
Then you were
people than
doing
we were
good.
helping.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I came home.
And how so? How so? Because it's
Sure.
like yeah, it's so interesting to, to hear that from someone actually who cuz you read and you hear and I read some of your background especially regarding your experience. I read your piece in Teen Vogue. I think it was brilliant, and just very raw, right? And I think that's what I appreciate about how you present your story, just authentically. It's like it just is what it is, right? And you're bold in how you speak up and manifest your experience and share it openly, right? And so what exactly of those exchanges with these Afghan families do you feel that were like to you like an aha moment of wait a
Mhm.
second, like what the hell am I doing here? What are we doing here? What because I think that would help, make it more tangible and palpable
Yeah,
for people and for me. Like I'm curious.
absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that question. So I ended up, there became a need a few months in, once we were kind of established on the ground. There was a need for a role at the battalion level that we were told that every battalion needed to have a strategic communications officer.
Okay.
Um, and so that was kind of a made up position at the time based on a need that command, the kind of higher level command saw, and it was meant to be this kind of hearts and minds component of
Hmm.
the transition process, right? Which made
Hmm.
sense to me. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, um, at the time, I was like, okay, we're trying to build up this infrastructure to help Afghan people be more established. And that means that we have to build up the credibility of the Afghan national government and the Afghan National Army if the
Hmm.
civilian population is going to take them seriously and be able to work with them and maintain, some level of safety and stability once we
Hmm.
withdraw completely, because that's what we were
Right.
gearing up. And
Right.
so that was what my role was supposed to be, was to kind of look at the combat and tactical operations that were underway. I was part of an engineer battalion, so we were doing construction operations, in several different contexts and capacities across the country. But we were also specifically building a massive um, kind of staging area where all of the equipment which had accumulated for a decade was going to be
Mhm.
moved so that we could ship it out of the country.
Mm.
And we were doing route clearance operations, which means that you drive around and you look for improvised explosive devices that have been placed in the ground in the road,
Oh,
and try
wow.
to safely dispose of them,
Oh my
so that they
God.
don't hurt people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, there I was, and to me, that my commander was kind of like, I don't really understand what this role is supposed to be, so you can make something of it or not. I don't really care. If you can make a case for how it's going to help the mission, I'll support you. And I was
Right.
like, okay, I can work with that. Um, and that mentality of, I really just want to do my combat operations. I'm not really interested, was a flag. And so that's the
Yeah.
first thing I would point to is I looked around, and the more and more I did that, right, I was doing these basically community outreach campaigns, right? I
Yes.
was meeting with community leaders. I was doing flyering the same way you would as a community organizer here, right?
Yes.
It's like
Uh-huh.
we were
Yeah.
literally designing flyers, and I was handing them out, and I was handing them out to other people to hand out, who were
Yeah.
Afghan people, and trying to build that sense of trust and credibility. And I would go back to meetings with my own fellow leaders, and I would hear racist commentary. I would
Mm.
hear things like, tomorrow night, we're going to do a night raid on XYZ village. And I would be like, why? That's why. That's not
Yeah.
our mission. And they
Right.
would say things like, well, because they're not cooperating with us. And I was like, right, they're terrified
Mm-hmm.
because we're armed to the teeth. We're
Right.
rolling through their villages in these enormous weaponized vehicles.
Right.
They know that we're going to leave at some point. So they are scared for their lives, rightfully, that if they are seen cooperating with us, that there might be retribution. And so
Right.
right, like how would raiding their village solve any of those problems? Um,
Right.
and so it was so many conversations like that where I would find myself fighting with our own people and officers and commanders who seemed like they wanted to just role play Call of Duty. That they were there, they wanted to feel like a
Mm.
cool guy, they wanted to get combat operations under their belt so that they could put it on their evaluation and try to paint themselves as war heroes or whatever it was. And that was incredibly disturbing to me
Yeah.
as someone who was, it was 1 minute I was in meetings like that, and the next minute I'm in a house with an Afghan woman and her children talking about the day to day struggles and the things that they actually needed, which were investment in care and
Yeah.
services, the same way our communities need here. Um,
That's
so,
incredible. Okay, wait a second. So,
yeah,
what you're telling me basically is that your schooling in activism and community outreach was by quote unquote accident and in another country. It was
I think that in some ways,
because they
that's
gave
fair to
you
say.
they
Yeah.
gave you like the freedom to really create this role. You ran with your heart, right? Because clearly you were driven by your heart, by really connecting at a human to human level,
Mhm.
you know, and you became embedded in the very communities, that you were living in, and you were getting to know people and really understanding their pain points, their struggles, and I'm sure feeling a lot of empathy, with your background also as a woman of color, right? And seeing that duality in your experience, what your white family experienced and what your Afro-Latino family experienced. Wow. So then that's incredible. So that was kind of like your how do you say? It's almost like your window into social impact
Mhm.
basically, and activism, and developing that muscle of speaking up and having a voice or being a leader and giving a voice to underserved or underrepresented or marginalized communities. I
Yeah.
mean, that's incredible. That's incredible that you were in this environment, and still you found your way to really make a difference in your own way. Wow. That's
Yeah.
really remarkable. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's like some of the important takeaways from that were one, it started to cause me to ask, I think often these things, people paint me as, some kind of crazy radical or someone who is just like a bleeding heart who has no practical. And for me, I think the questions that I started raising were from a practical consideration for
Mhm.
how to successfully accomplish the mission, right? I was very dedicated to this idea of the mission that we were supposed to be doing. And I think that the empathy and the human connection allowed me to understand the problem in a more holistic way. But my disturbance and the questions that were raised for me were ultimately about practical solutions. We're supposed to be leaving this place as well as possible. We're supposed to be
Mhm.
cultivating a sense of security and safety and stability. And the practical implementation I see of this is not going to accomplish that goal. And so
Mhm.
that started to, cause me to ask, well, what would it take? Why? If we know that that's not the case, right? We're over 10 years into the war at that point. Now we're
Mhm.
20 years in,
Mhm.
and, so why do we keep doing the same thing? And I think some of the takeaways for me were one, I could look around and see the contractors making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that started to plant seeds, right? About the profit
Mhm.
motive and the kind of profit and corporatism behind
Mhm.
some of those decisions that were being made. The other thing was a clarifying moment where this principle that you cannot use violence to create peace and to create safety.
Mm.
Um, and there's a disconnect here because if you ask most Americans, like, does violence solve our problems if you ask them, like, in terms of protest, right? Does violent? No, we should be nonviolent. We should peacefully advocate for change, right? We should do all of these things. Most people believe that, right? Most people believe in
Yeah.
this Martin Luther King Jr. vision of how to achieve progress and our goals, or at least the way that they've been taught Martin Luther King. And
Mhm.
and yet then we have these systems of policing and the military that we use to try to solve, which essentially are equipped with violence as their main
And
function
aggression. Yes.
mechanism,
Mhm.
right? To try to create safety and peace. And so that logic, that very core logic, I think we need to question that. And that was what was clear to me at the beginning, and that is a huge part of the activism that I got involved in, was not some kind of fantasy that there aren't real bad guys or there's not real violence in the world, but the need for us to question whether our solutions in a practical sense are actually having the results that we want them to have.
Mm.
And to the question of, if not, what actually creates true security and true safety in our communities here and abroad? And that has been a question that has guided a lot of my advocacy and activism today, and I think is continuing as a core component of this campaign.
Wow, that's deep. So you get back and then you leave the military, right?
Um,
Eventually. Or
Eventually, yeah.
yes.
So a lot of people don't realize that when teenagers, and I say that
Mhm.
really intentionally because we're talking about kids, right? We're talking about
Right.
teenagers who sign these contracts.
Mm.
Um, but when I signed that contract for that scholarship, which I'm grateful, that I was
Mhm.
able to get my access to college that way, I signed a contract at 18 that I wouldn't be free of until I was 30.
Oh,
And I just
wow.
want people to sit with that and to kind of think about that. And because I think that that's another thing that we need to be, it's something I talk about a lot, is like, I appreciate the sense of service and duty and commitment that so many people want to express when they sign up. And yet we have to talk about the poverty draft. We have to talk about the fact that, that people, we shouldn't have, teenagers shouldn't have to agree to kill for the government in order to get access to college, in order to get access to good jobs and good training, And
Wow.
so, and I think that, a world in which we do have, investment in other kinds of infrastructure would allow more pathways for service. And so,
Mhm.
all of that to say, fast forward, I came home. I struggled a lot to get on my feet, like a lot of veterans do. I didn't have the language for it at the time, but I would describe it now as moral injury that I was going through, and that I really had left as a true believer, believing I was going to help people, and came home clear that I had participated in catastrophic violence against the very
Wow.
people I really wanted to help. And
Wow.
um, so I really struggled. Thankfully, my partner was incredibly supportive. I moved to Staten Island. That was the first place I moved when I came back,
Uh-huh.
and I've moved ever since.
Mhm.
Um, and I didn't want to, I felt like I still had this I was still in the reserves. I had several years um left on my contract. And so I became a psychological operations officer officially, and um, was in the reserves, and I got involved in economic and racial justice work. And I think that
Nice.
I think that the reason I did that is because I still had this hunger to serve that hadn't been fulfilled, and I was like, I
Mhm.
want to do something that I feel like is actually going to be serving my communities, and
Mhm.
learn more about how to do that, and also why these systems are the way that they are.
Mhm.
So that was a lot, and I just kinda kept my head down. I didn't talk. I was angry and confused about what I had experienced, and I didn't talk a lot about the wars or being a veteran. I was a lot of people didn't even realize at my job, for a long time, and it wasn't until Colin Kaepernick took a knee, um, that was a very crystallizing moment for me, because
Wow.
I wrote this passionate face it almost sounds silly, right? I wrote this passionate Facebook post, um, making argument because I saw the backlash saying he was
Yeah.
disrespecting groups or the flag or veterans, right? And I was like, wait a minute, I'm a veteran, and I think that this man is fighting for freedom and justice that we say that we believe in this country. If anything, that should be considered very patriotic, right? And so
Right.
I wrote a whole post about it with bullet point arguments and everything. I was also a high school debater, so like the debate nerd in me came out.
Yes.
Um, and I was shocked by how many people replied saying, I hadn't thought of some of these points. These are really good points. Thank you. I hadn't
Mhm.
thought of these, but I still just can't support him because the veterans. And that moment, I was like, you're saying this to a veteran, though. Like, how do
Right.
you not understand?
Yeah.
And that was when
Yeah.
I realized, wow, this kind of plastic patriotism, as I've come to understand it, or this conditioned, just empty, knee-jerk response. Um, I don't feel offended, for example, when people say thank you for your service, but I always want to beg the question of what was my service actually in service of?
Mhm. Mhm.
Did it actually serve our communities? Did it
Mhm.
actually fight for freedom and justice? And I don't feel like it did. And I think that we should be honest about that. And that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that we need to disrespect that, people like me signed up wanting to fight for those things, right? And that's
Mhm.
worthy of perhaps a thanks or an admiration, but we also need to tell the truth about what's really happening.
Right.
And so that's when I started speaking out about the wars, because I realized we're actually not going to get economic or racial or gender justice if we also don't confront these kinds of knee jerk ideas that have not been challenged, right? That have been allowed to be repeated and repeated and
Yeah.
repeated, but questioned.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for your service. And that's why I thank Tristeza for her service too, because the service is exactly what you're doing, right? Is speaking up and just being real about, yeah, about what's been done and what the issues are and possible solutions to fix it. What propelled you then? So I know that it took some nudging. You just mentioned that, right? To actually take that step and really committing to running for office and then outlining your, your plan and platform and getting your team together. So what was that process like? And what was like that, I can only imagine it's like a pressure cooker that keeps heating up and heating up heating up until finally, it's time to take the lid off, and let it free. So then what was that process like? How long did it take? And what was that, do you remember that decisive moment where you're like, yeah, you know what, fuck it, I'm gonna do this, that's it, I'm
Absolutely.
in. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so I went through this, like I said, I started speaking out, I got involved in movement, and I went through this whole ordeal because I got involved with the Poor People's Campaign. I started organizing. So I was going to, rural communities all over New York and across New
Mm,
York City too, um, talking about the Poor People's Campaign, doing community trainings, right? And really learned a lot about organizing and also about poverty in America from Reverend
mm,
Barber. And I really appreciate his framing that, the real issue here is not left versus right, it's top versus bottom.
mm,
The ultra wealthy, whatever label that they put next to them, a D or an R, a lot of times it ends up in a lot of ways being two sides of the same coin. It's the ultra wealthy people buying their way into pulling the strings for the decisions that get made in this country that ultimately don't actually help working class people, right? And working
right.
people who need it most. And so I learned a lot through that. So I gave this speech in front of tens of thousands of people for the Poor People's Campaign. And I didn't break any rules in the military. I wasn't in uniform. I didn't even say I was a troop still, and that was the first time I got threatened with investigation. So, and then
Oh.
soon after that, I continued to speak out and I just shared publicly available facts, nothing secret, nothing,
Hmm.
and didn't break any rules. I just shared one fact a day while I was on orders. And it was things like we're currently bombing 6+ countries that are all Black, brown, impoverished countries. We
Wow.
are burning 10.3 million gallons of oil per day, the DOD alone per day.
Wow.
um Basic things like that that came from government reports. And the next thing I knew, I was on the front page of the Army Times as Army officer goes on anti-military tirade, I think was the
Oh my God.
headline.
Yeah, like,
And it was
yes,
this whole
like
right, it was this whole dramatic
insubordinate, right?
thing.
Insubordinate behavior. Yeah, right.
Right. And again, yeah, and then I was then my investigation was later transferred to the Army Counter Intel Unit
My
with the
goodness.
insinuation that I was some kind of traitor or insider threat, right?
Mm,
Insider threat is what they call it. Um, so, I went through all of this for literally just sharing the facts that are in our own publicly available government reports. And I think that that says a lot, right? It
yes.
said a lot to me that if the truth is considered this dangerous, then we have to keep telling it.
Yeah.
So, I went through that whole thing and then I was content. I'm now the organizing director of About Face Veterans Against the War. We're all
Mhm,
post 9/11 military veterans who share experiences like this and tell the truth
mhm,
about
mhm,
these wars and speak up to end them.
mhm.
Um, and I was very content working towards our movement goals and fighting for our communities in that capacity. And I was in my mind, I was like on a 3 to 5 year track, of like, okay, these are the things I want to accomplish for the movement, for this organization, for this community. Um, and then one day I met a fellow, organizer from the district in my backyard at someone's socially distanced, one of my good friends socially distanced
Mhm.
birthday parties.
Yeah.
She had like 5 people over and used my backyard, and he asked me some questions. And the next Wednesday, he followed up and he said, "I scheduled time on your calendar, and I want you to know that I plan to recruit you to run for Congress." And I was just like, "Wait, what? No, that's a terrible idea." I went through this dramatic investigation. I curse like a sailor. I'm not like one of those people
Exactly.
who runs for office, like I'm not that person, And he was like, "That's fine. Just collect all of your concerns and we'll talk about them then." And um, so we had that conversation and I talked to several other organizers in the district who he had already organized on board with this idea. He was like,
Yeah.
"Everybody, we should get Brittany to run, and she's the one who we should draft." And I think that that was a step forward for our district, was for folks to come together and say, instead of just whoever throws their hat in the ring because of ego or because of their career aspirations or whatever, let's actually draft someone who we know is already fighting these fights in a different capacity
Right.
to
Hmm.
represent us and in a different, in a more powerful position. And so I then went through this, process. I was terrified. Honestly, I was like,
Yeah.
this is a terrible idea. I will help you recruit someone else. Um, I cannot, no. But I went through the process. I talked to probably 20 to 25 movement leaders,
Mm,
um, and who are my friends, who are people that I'm accountable to, elders, right? I mean, a whole variety. And
mhm.
I was floored by how unanimously almost people were like, I believe in this strategy and I think you should do this because I think that we need a veteran who is willing to tell the truth, who someone who has been, mentored and developed in our movements, who is deeply
Mhm,
committed to our movement values of fighting for our communities to be
mhm.
representing us in this capacity. And we will support you in this. And I asked several people who I thought would be like, absolutely not, don't do this,
Yeah,
even people who like don't even believe in the government, right? And even they were like, yes, you should
do
do
it. Yeah, yeah.
this. And
Well,
so,
maybe because of that, because you just don't fit the mold in the sense of you're not attached to anybody. I admire that you're not accepting any, you're completely, you don't want any kind of corporate donations. You're really staying true to your commitment to community. And I really do admire that. That you're not going to be moved by any kind of, private interests or third parties that are going to stray you from speaking up and doing what you need to do for working class Americans. I think that, and for people, I mean, it sounds to me like you're a global citizen in that respect, right? That you see the bigger picture. And that, I
Mhm.
think that's freaking awesome. That's awesome.
Thank
That's right.
you.
So
Thank you.
basically, it happened in a barbecue, right? Exactly. It's like unbeknownst to you, and unbeknownst to you, because you kind of didn't even make the decision yourself, it was
Yeah.
really a community, yeah, that basically selected you. And I think that's amazing. I think that's great. I want to go over, the things that you stand for, and I think we got a lot of that already. But you're very clear in how you outline, and I'm sure it's because you studied your district, right? And your future constituents,
Mhm.
very well. And so, when you talk about care, not criminalization, does that really entail?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I'll make this plug now that, what's being referenced is on our website. So if folks want to read more, it's brittanyforcongress.org, all spelled normally.
Mhm.
And it's on our issues page. And we wanted to start with principles. Because I think that that's what I want people to know that they can trust about me is that I don't know everything. I'm not some kind of policy wonk who knows all of the things, but what I am is I'm incredibly rooted in a clear set of principles and a commitment to take responsibility seriously, to look at the data, to look at and listen to the lived experience of people most impacted by things and ask and work with those folks to answer the question together of what actually meets the need, what solves the problem. And
Mhm.
so, in that sense, we feel like the set of principles and agenda that we put together is really a common sense. It's the basics. of what people
Mm.
need, right? When we talk about care, not criminalization, what we're saying is whether you're talking about the so called war on drugs, which has been used as an instrument to imprison and traumatize millions and millions of disproportionately black, brown, and indigenous people, but also everyone, also poor white people, also middle
Mhm.
class. I mean, just
Y
everyone to a degree that hasn't actually addressed the problem, right?
Right.
The cartels, the violence
The gangs. Yeah.
of drug trade, right? All of those things, the opioid and
Mhm.
overdose crisis, none of those things have been solved through
Mhm.
arresting people and further traumatizing them by putting them in prison or whatever it is, or making it
Mhm.
harder for them to get housing and really the care that they need.
Mhm.
And so, for something like that, we say we should decriminalize this and treat this like a public health issue to make sure
Mhm.
that people have the resources, the education, and the care that they need to be able um, to navigate these issues, and that would actually address, right? We need harm reduction measures that actually keep people alive. If what we're concerned about is the opioid epidemic, for example, which
Mhm.
the overdose crisis has hit this district incredibly hard.
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
People who are suffering from addiction need help. They need care. They need, access to safe and supportive wraparound services. They don't need to be thrown in jail. That doesn't help them.
Mhm.
Um, so, that's one example. Also, when we talk about, whether we're talking about, immigration or sex work or any of these things, what we're talking about is what really makes our communities safe and whole
Mm.
and
Yeah.
healthy. And
Yes.
let's advance policies that center that.
Yeah.
I think that gets back to that fundamental principle that I was mentioning that I did see with my own eyes is that
Yeah.
meeting something with violence and brute force does not
It's not
actually
gonna.
cultivate safety. That
Yes.
that
Mhm.
investment in education and healthcare and services and community infrastructure creates safety.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great. And all of these things are interconnected because I know that you also have on your platform on your like list of priorities, and it seems like I'm sure it's daunting that it's like you see at everything that needs to be fixed, right? Or
Yeah.
addressed. It's just so much, but I see that you also, focus on climate and security, education and youth, which you kind of just mentioned, jobs and
Mhm.
housing opportunities for everyone. And it's amazing that that you made that distinction about that it's not black or white, right? It's really about rich and poor, and so it
Mhm.
seems like everything that you've thought everything out from that lens, to make sure that basic human needs are met, and that the recovery and and this transition is fair for everybody, and that everyone has what they need to be able to live with dignity. I love there's some I read somewhere that you were talking about that this idea that there's scarcity in the US is a lie, and that it was a hard realization when you saw realized that, right? When you came to terms or became aware of that. Is that kind of like one of the foundational principles of your platform?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, when we talk about these things like Medicare for all and passing a Green New Deal, the question that's always raised is, but how will we afford it? Um, and yet, and then you'll also hear this pushback that says, oh, well, people just want handouts or they just want freebies and blah, 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 blah. Well, I would say that what we're really talking about is how do we want to spend our resources? Because that's
Mm,
what it is, right? We all pay trillions and trillion dollars of taxes, and that's mostly us,
mhm.
mostly working people. It's not the ultra wealthy billionaires and corporations, right? We already know that they're skipping out paying, $750 a year apparently on their taxes while they're bragging
Yeah,
about being a successful billionaire or whatever, like our former president. Um,
right.
but the truth is that we're pouring trillions and trillions into projecting warfare and bombing campaigns and occupations all over the world when we could be using those resources to actually invest in meeting the needs of our communities. And that's what it really is. It's a question of priorities. It's a question of
Yeah.
our values, and it's not a question of whether we have the resources. It's a question of what kind of society we want to create. And I think that we're in a moment right now where we get to decide that.
Yeah.
And we get to say, not just we're going to beg for crumbs off of the tables of these people who have controlled the power for so long, but we're going to come into our power, and we're going to restructure things in a way that is actually centered on meeting needs and putting people over profit.
Yes, absolutely. And bake some bread. We're gonna bake.
Yeah,
We don't want the crumbs. We're gonna go ahead and bake some bread. Yes,
right. And we're going to distribute, everybody gets to feast. Everybody gets
yes,
to feast. And there is
yes,
enough to go around if we decide that that's how we want to structure things.
yes, totally. I love that. I really, really love that. I just feel it takes a huge amount of courage, to do what you're doing, just being like in the public light now, and doing what you're doing. But it looks to me like you've got the smarts, the grit, and the right team behind you, right?
Thank
To
you
get
so
this shit
much.
done. And I'm just so proud to meet you finally. I know that we've been playing with dates, and trying to have this this encounter, and I've learned a lot from it, and I definitely am rooting for you. I think you're going to do a wonderful job, and I know you're going to make a huge difference in your district and in Congress, when you get there. And so I'm really happy for you, and congratulations for taking this leap. And I wanted just to ask you one last thing. What do you recommend people, to anyone, that is being nudged? Right, because there are a lot of people out there that are activists, that are filled with integrity, and that have heart for community, right, and
Mhm.
are not compromising, right, their integrity too, for a buck or fame or whatever, accolades or whatever. What would you recommend them to do, or to consider, in terms of running for office?
Absolutely. I think I would offer them, I called one of my friends and mentors, and she gave me really powerful advice when I asked her. I told her that I was being, I had the opportunity, that I was being kind of, there was a call being made on me. Um and she said, I think that you have to evaluate this from the place of an assignment, right? And like it's kind of like, we are working towards these big, audacious, transformative changes that cannot be made by one politician, that cannot be made by any one individual leader in movement or in politics. And so, and it's easy, I think, to get lost in that system, to get lost
Mhm.
in ego, in pressure, in just, whatever it is. And so, she said, if you are going to go into this, the thing that's going to keep you grounded is being on purpose.
Mm,
And on purpose in that context meant, how is this, decision going to advance the goals that you're already committed to in movement? And she
mm,
gave me arguments. She was like, here's the way that I think it could advance those goals. But I think it can't be about you, um, or your career or your kind of goals. It has, in that sense, but it does have to be about you in terms of, do you feel like this is the right role for you to play in that particular moment in advancing things that are really bigger than a policy, or, even any immediate leadership that you can offer, but that are really about coming together as part of a collective peoples who are pushing for real transformation. And I think that if you sit with that and you ask yourself, um, that question, I think that if you listen hard enough to all the parts of yourself, right, the practical parts and that intuition, that gut feeling, um, that you'll come, that you'll be able to find a sense of groundedness, not just make the right decision, but be able to stay clear and stay
Hmm.
heard in the midst of all the fundraising and the chaos and the stress and the pressure and yes, the attacks that will come
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
lucky.
This is wonderful. Well, listen, it's Brittany for Congress.org, plain and simple, right? And yeah, we need to support you. I can't wait. I can't wait to celebrate with you, and
Thank
with the
you.
people of the 11th district in Staten
Yes,
Island,
we're doing it
that
together.
that change is coming, right? So thank you so much for making the time to join us, and we'll have a follow up. How's that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and for holding the space for me to share so much of my story. It's really been an honor.
Yes. Thank you so much. Okay, have a great week. Okay.
Bye.
This concludes this episode of I Have Something to Say. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. There's more to come next week. And remember, if you have something to say, it's time to speak up.